My own reading in this area suggests that these people, maybe they have not been bad people, but it is also true, somewhere along the line, they didn't believe in an afterlife. And one of the things that happened to you that is really bad is that if you don't believe in afterlife, you get there, and since thoughts are things, your thought has made it impossible for you to see beyond beyond where you're at.
That's the interpretation?
That's the interpretation.
Of why some difference?
So there is a darkness, and I don't know what there are half a dozen different books that try to describe why that darkness occurs and how to get back out of it. Remember, we're only dealing with people who go through enough of this experience to come to the conclusion that they need to go back. There are many other levels, I think, of experience which are much more profound and lead to probably different conclusions. There are some really bad stories. One person gets down there and ends up and finds herself looking at the face of rage. This face of rage is full of anger and bitterness and intends to harm this person who has come down to show herself in front of him. And she is terrified. And finally she says, I know what you're trying to do. You're trying to make me think that I'm like you. And maybe to some extent, because she had lived a life in which she was easily angered and mad, maybe that's indeed what was happening to her in this hell. But as soon as that was said, the sense of rage was replaced by another image. And this was the image of greed. And the image of greed was one that sucked on people. That sounds like hell, does it not? And finally she said, you can't tell me that I'm like you. I don't accept that. I don't believe it. Jesus, save me. And then far away, the image of a light appears. She goes toward the light, and then some portion of the rest of the story emerges. There are other people who said,
she is resuscitated.
And she's resuscitated, and now comes back and says, oh boy, and you know, that person would not talk about this for 10 years. Why? Are you going to explain how it was that you went to hell? Most people couldn't handle it. And eventually, however, she got to the point where she could do this. Because most of them come back and say, you know, there was something yet I had to do in life. And for that person, she needed probably to say what it was, the alternative solution. What can also happen to you.
How is it that some seem to get a second chance?
There was one person who had this experience and came back and said, I know the answer to that. And the answer is that our God is a loving God, and He does not want anybody to suffer eternally in the presence of the Almighty.
And we all know that. We already know that.
You already know that.
Oh, right.
Okay? Well, we're going to have to eventually cover the question of judgment too. Okay? But I'll tell you what, if I have to choose between justice and mercy, give me mercy. During this period of out-of-body experience, the individual is finding out more about themselves. And they discover that they left a body down there, but they still have a body.
How so? I mean,
The,
arms or just a
they mostly they remember being able to have arms. They just don't know what they're good for. For example, there they are, drifting above the operating table, looking down, and they discover that their relatives are next door talking about what's going on. And so this party, this entity, drops down, grabs a hold of the handle and said, I'm going to go see my friends and relatives. And it turns out that the hand can't quite turn the handle because there is no physical hand to manipulate a physical thing like that. And then after a while they say, you know what, forget it, because I can go right through that door. And there finds his relatives talking about whatever they're talking about, and when he is resuscitated and brought back to his body, he says, you know, during the operation I went next door and you guys were talking about so-and-so and so-and-so. They said, well, how do you know that? I said, well, I just went over there and I looked and I, you know. Now listen, that's a clue to you. You have a relative that dies, don't go saying bad things. Especially, you know, when you're in the will and you... So just be a little bit careful on that subject. All right. There is also an out-of-body, a timelessness, a clarity of thought, and a travel by thinking. That is, as soon as they can turn their attention toward some object or some person, they can almost immediately gain access to that person. And when they get there, they can understand what the other person is saying, but they cannot themselves communicate to them. I guess depending on which part of this you picked up first. I'm not so sure that's exactly in the right order, but let's just say that it is. There is, and finally, the being of light, and here we are on that subject. Let me just read some of this to you, and you can, it's because it's easier for you to come to a conclusion about it. The being of light. The thought came to my mind, lovest thou me? He is then in the presence of this being. And the question was, lovest thou me? This was not exactly in the form of a question, but I guess the connotation of what the light said was, if you do love me, go back and complete what you began in your life. And all during this time, I felt as though I were surrounded by overwhelming love and compassion. Here's another person repeating this. Now I think that the voice that was talking to me actually realized that I wasn't ready to die. You know, it was just kind of testing me more than anything else. Yet from the moment the light spoke to me, I felt really good, secure and loved. The love that came from it is just unimaginable and indescribable. It was from a person to be with, and it had a sense of humor too, definitely. And so let me get started on a question or two, and then you folks just jump in whenever you think it's appropriate, all right? One of the questions was, why doesn't everybody get a second chance? That is, these people, after all, arrive. God, the Spirit of Light, says, but you have to go back. You're not ready yet, and in going back, you ought to now fulfill the duties that you once promised to yourself and to the Lord. And so, why doesn't everybody get that second chance? I think I've got a couple of answers. One answer is everybody gets a second chance. Today is the second chance from yesterday. Did you want a second chance? Well, then change your way of doing things. That's at least one response to that. The second answer is, well, actually, there is the truth is we all get to fulfill, or hopefully we all get to fulfill our destiny. These people apparently had not yet done that, and they needed to come back to earth in order to do what they needed to do. Well, I know somebody who died not too long ago, and died in the faith, believed that she was going to heaven. It must have been her time to go. It is not an appropriate unquote, quote unquote, response to say, why did she have to go? Well, because she wanted to or needed to fulfill the destiny that she had perhaps, that was laid out for her.
Would that be God's will?
We must all believe that these things are God's will.
What do you mean by destiny?
What's that?
What do you mean by destiny?
Well, I'm using an assumption that you once promised, or you needed to do something in life. Whatever it was, apparently it had not yet been fulfilled. Those people who come back are almost always filled with a sense of mission. So whatever their destiny was is whatever they're now selecting to do. Now, they're not always aware of it. They're not always, I'm not so sure I know what to do. And for a lot of people, and that remains true for a while until they say, yeah, you know what, I'm glad I came back. I was able to help my children grow up. Pretty important thing that had to be done. And there are cases after cases in which that, quote, destiny is being worked out.
So you're saying, I guess that's when I hear about destiny, I hear two different ways of thinking about destiny, as in what someone else has determined you're going to do, or destiny as in what God knows what you're going to do, but He hasn't necessarily determined it. It is not always remembered. In fact, it is frequently not remembered. The peculiar thing about this is that, you're talking in these cases.
yes, in these cases, memory still seems to be operating. They come back and they say, well, they remembered enough to talk about the out-of-body experience and the light and a variety of other things here. They remember enough to do that so that somehow this story gets pieced together. But not all of them, not everybody remembers everything, and that's just the way it is.
Well, sort of people have felt like rejection too when they came back.
Oh, yeah.
Like they weren't accepted into heaven, they came back and they felt like dejection or rejection.
That's somewhere down here, my next point or so. Please, come on in. Here's one of the questions that came up. It came up explicitly and it came up implicitly. And the question was the being of light, and we're going to go into that. Who was it? Okay. And generally speaking, the answer, if just probably added it all up, the most frequent answer is that they met the Master. And by that they understand intuitively, most of them, more of them than not, Jesus Christ.
And you're saying this is the,
Yes,
this is the
this
consensus
is
of what people's testimony.
probably, if there's a consensus, that's the most frequent answer. But it's not the only answer given. And that's where we come into the problem, isn't it? Because what these writers are saying is that your first experience with the being of light is what you're expecting that to be. And, well, that opens up a whole lot of stuff, does it not? What you're expecting it to be for, I said to a Jewish friend, who do you think you would find in that being of light? Would it be Moses? And she said, nah, because we don't think of Moses that way. We don't think of Moses as a savior, as a personality that we should be beholden to or love. No, it would be an angel. We think there are people who use the word angel. Now, suppose someone said, "Oh yeah, but okay, so it's an angel," but the next person comes along and says, "No, I think that's Allah." And for a while, apparently, and this is now reflecting on other experience and other information, for a while that's maybe tolerable, because that's who they expected. Or Mohammed is going to lead them down to that. Well, it's filled with whoever it's filled with. And so there are other answers, and the answers come to you on what is expected. Now remember, this is the first exposure and experience in the so-called afterlife, if that's what we're dealing with here. And there are hundreds of experiences still to follow. And I've read about some of those experiences.